Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going deep into this Amnesty International report.
Oh,
It's
sure.
called You Feel Like You Are Subhuman, Israel's Genocide Against Palestinians in Gaza.
Uh-huh.
And, right off the bat, this report is laser-focused
Yeah.
on a very specific period between October 7th, 2023 and July 2024.
Okay.
Just so everyone's aware of the time frame we're looking at.
Yeah.
And I have to say, just prepping for this, even reading through the material, it's pretty heavy stuff,
Yeah, for sure.
We need to be sensitive to that.
Absolutely. Sensitivity is key here. We're unpacking what Amnesty found. We're not here to offer opinions or pick sides or anything.
Right.
Think of it this way. This report, it lays everything out systematically. It sets the stage, dives into specific events, and then, presents all this evidence to back up their conclusion, which is that genocide did occur.
Yeah, and one thing that really stood out to me reading through this was how they describe Gaza as incredibly densely populated area, very limited resources, just like overflowing with refugees. I mean, that alone paints a very intense picture, even before we get into what happened in 2023 and 2024.
It's a crucial point, that density, that lack of resources. It's all connected to history. You've got the displacement of Palestinians back in 1948, an event they call the Nakba. Then decades of occupation. And now you have this ongoing blockade.
Right.
All these factors, they shape the reality on the ground in Gaza. And the report makes the argument that these factors have made the population incredibly vulnerable.
And then there's this term, apartheid. Amnesty uses it to describe Israel's policies in the occupied Palestinian territories.
Right. Right. And this is where some clarification might be helpful for our listener. Apartheid in this context, it refers to a system of discrimination and segregation that, according to Amnesty, puts Palestinians at a systematic disadvantage, denies them basic rights. It's a loaded term, obviously, but it's central to how Amnesty frames the whole situation.
Okay, so you have this already volatile situation, right? And then, boom, October 7th, 2023. Hamas, along with some other Palestinian armed groups, they launch attacks into Israel, killing over 1,200 people, mostly civilians. Yeah. Just a horrific, horrific thing. And the report, to their credit, doesn't shy away from that. Yeah. They clearly state these attacks, they were war crimes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Amnesty isn't trying to justify those attacks at all or downplay how serious they were, but then they shift their focus to Israel's response, which they argue went way beyond, what you'd consider legitimate self-defense.
Right.
Crossed the line into acts of genocide.
So break it down for me, that response.
Right.
What exactly did Israel do?
It was a multi-pronged offensive. You had airstrikes, relentless airstrikes, then a ground invasion of Gaza, and a complete siege that sealed off the entire territory. By October 7th, 2024, a year after those initial attacks, the report estimates the Palestinian death toll in Gaza had reached 42,010. Staggering number. Another 97,590 injured.
Those numbers are they're almost impossible to comprehend. I mean, the international community, did they just stand by and watch all this happen?
Well, there was a response, but, how effective it was, that's debatable. You had countries calling for a ceasefire. The UN, they issued condemnations, they passed resolutions. Even the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, they got involved. But even with all that, violence just kept going.
It's hard to wrap my head around something like that happening on such a scale with the entire world watching.
Oh.
But let's get to the heart of this report. The genocide allegations. I vaguely remember learning about the Genocide Convention back in school, but it's probably worth revisiting that. What exactly makes something a genocide under international law?
Great question. The Genocide Convention, it was adopted in 1948, and it defines genocide as any of 5 specific acts. But here's the key. They have to be committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. That concept of intent, it's crucial. It's not just about the acts themselves, It's about proving there was a deliberate plan, a plan to eliminate a specific group of people.
So Amnesty's claiming that Israel committed these acts with the intent to destroy Palestinians in Gaza. Okay, so what evidence are they using to back up such a serious claim?
They break down their analysis act by act, starting with the first act, killing members of the group. Their investigation really zeroes in on 15 very specific Israeli airstrikes. These strikes resulted in mass civilian casualties.
So I'm guessing they're not just looking at the number of casualties, right?
No. They go much deeper than that. Amnesty, they did extensive on-the-ground research, interviewing eyewitnesses, painstakingly analyzing satellite imagery, even examining, fragments of weaponry recovered from the sites of these strikes. Their goal was to piece together a really detailed picture of each incident looking for patterns, and evidence that pointed to potential intent.
Can you give me an example, like one of these airstrikes that really jumped out at you from the report?
Well, one that really resonated with me was the strike on the Aldo's family home. This was in the Zaytun neighborhood of Gaza City. It happened on October 7th, 2023, the very first day of the offensive. The report describes how this home was hit and 15 civilians were killed, including 7 children. And they have these eyewitness accounts describing the utter devastation, the panic, frantically searching for survivors amidst the rubble.
It's easy to, get caught up in the numbers, but when you hear those personal stories, it just hits you, the human cost of all of this. So Amnesty saying these weren't isolated incidents.
Exactly. They argue that these 15 airstrikes, they're representative of a much broader pattern. They point to the use of heavy explosive weapons in areas that were densely populated. And they say this resulted in disproportionate harm to civilians, and they suggest a deliberate disregard for civilian lives.
That brings us to the second act of genocide, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. And we've already touched on those casualty figures, but the report, it doesn't stop there, right?
Oh, absolutely not. They dive into the long-term consequences of the offensive, the physical and psychological trauma, the lasting trauma inflicted on the survivors. Think about it. 97,590 injured. That's a massive burden on an already struggling healthcare system. We're talking about the potential for long-term health complications, disabilities, a whole generation scarred by this conflict.
Look, there's a ripple effect of suffering that extends far beyond the immediate aftermath. And Amnesty seems to be saying that this suffering, this trauma, it wasn't just foreseeable, but potentially intentional, which leads us to the third act of genocide, right?
Yes. The third act, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the group's physical destruction. Amnesty argues that this happened through what they call a slow death strategy, this gradual but deliberate deprivation of essential resources, which ultimately, they say, aims to destroy a population.
And this is where the siege of Gaza comes in.
Precisely. Remember, the siege, it severely restricted the flow of everything: food, clean water, medicine, fuel, everything you need to survive. Amnesty paints this really bleak picture of life under siege: widespread food shortages, people forced to drink contaminated water, hospitals struggling to function without basic supplies. They even cite instances of people resorting to eating animal fodder just to survive out of desperation.
It's just horrifying, and it's hard to imagine that none of this could have been prevented.
And that's a key part of Amnesty's argument. They point out that humanitarian organizations, they had been warning about this, the potential for a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, for years before the 2023 offensive. The consequences of the siege, they weren't unforeseen, they were predictable, they were preventable.
Which raises a crucial question. Were these consequences just unintended side effects of the siege, or were they part of a calculated plan? That question of intent, like you said before, it's key to proving genocide.
Exactly. And that's precisely what we'll be unpacking in the next part of our deep dive, how Amnesty uses the evidence to support their claim of intent. Picking up where we left off, let's dive into how Amnesty addresses, the fourth and fifth acts of genocide, as defined by that genocide convention.
Okay, remind me, what are those 2 acts again?
Right. So the fourth act, that's imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And the fifth one is forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And what's interesting is that the report, it doesn't really present evidence related to that fourth act. They focus more on the fifth act, and specifically the mass evacuations that Israel ordered during the offensive.
Oh, right. This is the whole thing about humanitarian zones, right? I remember reading about that and just thinking, what does that even mean? In a war zone?
Yeah, and that's exactly the point. The report, it highlights how ambiguous these zones were and how the boundaries kept shifting. Just imagine, being told to flee your home, seeking safety in these designated areas, but the boundaries are constantly changing. It's like a terrifying game of musical chairs, right? Yeah. Except, with potentially deadly consequences.
That must have been so disorienting and traumatic for families trying to, escape the violence.
Absolutely. And the report doesn't just talk about it abstractly. They share these really personal accounts from families who were caught up in this nightmare. One story that really stayed with me was about a family. They had young children, and they were forced to move multiple times because those safe zones kept changing, and they ended up crammed into a school gymnasium with hundreds of other displaced people, no proper sanitation, living in constant fear.
It's those personal stories that really, bring home the human impact, the fear, the desperation that people faced. But you mentioned earlier that intent is crucial to proving genocide. It's not enough to show these acts happen. Amnesty has to demonstrate there was this deliberate plan to destroy Palestinians in Gaza. So what kind of evidence are they using to back that up?
Well, they looked really closely at public statements made by, Israeli officials, military personnel, looking for patterns, in their rhetoric. Explicit calls for the destruction of Gaza.
So what were some of the, I don't know, most striking examples they found?
There were numerous instances of calls to erase Gaza, make it disappear. Some officials even used biblical justifications, specifically the story of Amalek, which, in some interpretations, it calls for the complete annihilation of an enemy group.
That's a pretty chilling parallel to draw, especially in a situation like this.
It certainly raises questions about the mindset and motivations behind the offensive. And, the report also points out that this wasn't just rhetoric coming from, the top. They found examples of soldiers on the ground echoing this language, filming themselves, celebrating the destruction of Palestinian homes and property. It suggests this culture of dehumanization that really permeated the entire military operation.
So how does Amnesty connect this rhetoric to, concrete actions that might point to intent?
They highlight two key areas: the obstruction of humanitarian aid and the deliberate destruction of essential civilian infrastructure.
Okay, let's start with the aid. Didn't Israel claim they were facilitating humanitarian assistance to Gaza?
They did. But Amnesty's investigation tells a very different story. They document these deliberate delays, limited access points for aid deliveries, stringent security checks that just held up essential supplies. They give examples of fuel requests for hospitals being denied, obstructed medical supplies, bureaucratic hurdles that made it almost impossible for aid organizations to, operate effectively.
It's almost as if they were, weaponizing aid.
Yeah.
Controlling the flow of vital resources to put pressure on the population.
Exactly. That's the point Amnesty seems to be making. And they go even further by highlighting the destruction of infrastructure that was essential for the survival of the civilian population in Gaza. I mean, we're talking about water treatment plants, hospitals, power stations, agricultural land, the very foundations of life.
It's one thing to, target military objectives, but this seems like it goes way beyond that.
Right. And Amnesty argues that in a lot of cases, there was no military justification for destroying this civilian infrastructure. And they offer specific examples, like the demolition of the Al-Azhar University campus, the Al-Dalal Mosque. These weren't military targets, they were pillars of the community.
So putting all this together, the airstrikes, the siege, the rhetoric, the destruction of infrastructure, what's Amnesty's conclusion? Do they come right out and say that Israel committed genocide in Gaza?
Their conclusion is pretty clear. They believe that the evidence is strong enough to conclude that Israel did commit genocide in Gaza. And they're very careful to emphasize that their analysis is based on, extensive research, evidence gathering, and that it's not driven by political bias.
That's a very weighty accusation. But like you said earlier, it ultimately falls to international legal bodies to make that formal determination genocide. So what happens next? What does Amnesty recommend?
They have a series of recommendations aimed at different parties. For Israel, they call for, an immediate end to the blockade of Gaza, full accountability for any crimes committed during the offensive, and unhindered access for, humanitarian aid and international investigators.
What about Hamas? Any recommendations for them?
Yeah, Amnesty urges Hamas to release all hostages and to ensure the humane treatment of captives in line with international law.
So it sounds like they're trying to hold all sides accountable, not just focusing on one side of the conflict. What about the international community? What's their role in all of this?
Well, Amnesty calls on the international community to, take concrete steps to investigate these allegations, maybe through bodies like the International Criminal Court. And they also urge the international community to put pressure on all parties to uphold international law, respect human rights, and ensure the protection of civilians.
It's a reminder that this isn't just an internal conflict. It has, international implications, demands a coordinated global response. We've been talking about some very heavy stuff, but I want to circle back to something you said earlier, the dehumanization of Palestinians. It's one thing to read about airstrikes and casualty figures, but the language used to describe the enemy, to justify the violence, it gets under your skin in a different way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The report, it devotes a lot of space to analyzing the rhetoric used by, Israeli officials, religious leaders, even ordinary soldiers on social media. And it's a chilling collection of statements that dehumanize Palestinians, portraying them as less than human, as a threat that needs to be eliminated, like vermin to be exterminated.
There's a quote from the report that really stuck with me. It's from an Israeli rabbi. And he said, there is no such thing as an innocent Palestinian. That kind of language is terrifying because it basically strips an entire population of their humanity, makes it easier to justify violence against them.
Exactly, exactly. And the report argues that this kind of dehumanizing rhetoric, it creates a climate, a dangerous climate,
Yeah.
where violence becomes normalized, where the lines between, combatants and civilians, they get blurred. It's like laying the groundwork for atrocities to happen.
This deep dive has been, well, incredibly informative, but also deeply unsettling. I appreciate you guiding us through this material. It's so complex and emotionally charged.
My pleasure. And to our listener, I just want to emphasize this report, it's incredibly thorough, but it's just one piece of a much larger puzzle. I encourage you to explore further, read the full Amnesty report, seek out analyses from other organizations, and most importantly, engage with different perspectives on this conflict.
As we wrap up, one thing keeps sticking with me. We've covered so much, right? From the specifics of Amnesty's report to, well, the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a lot to take in. But at the end of the day, this is about people, real people, whose lives have been shattered, families ripped apart, communities just devastated.
You're absolutely right. We have to remember that human dimension, approach this with empathy, recognize the suffering, and it's on all sides. I mean, yes, Amnesty's focused on these allegations of genocide against Palestinians, but we can't forget Israeli civilians were also victims of violence. They lost lives, loved ones in those Hamas attacks.
It's just a reminder that violence leads to more violence, and this cycle of suffering, it just seems endless. I know our deep dive is about understanding this report, but I can't help but wonder, what now? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? The report itself tries to offer some direction with their recommendations. Amnesty is calling on Israel to end the blockade, right? Ensure accountability for any crimes committed. Allow unhindered access for humanitarian aid. They urge Hamas to release those hostages. Ensure humane treatment of captives. And, a big one, they're calling on the international community to step up, actually investigate these allegations, potentially through bodies like the International Criminal Court.
I'm curious, from your perspective, what's the biggest takeaway here? What should our listener be thinking about after absorbing all of this?
I think this report shines a light on international law and how important those accountability mechanisms are to prevent things like genocide, to address them when they happen. Whether or not someone agrees with Amnesty's conclusion, the evidence they lay out, it raises some serious questions about the systems in place internationally. Are they strong enough? Are they being used effectively?
It feels like this report, even if it doesn't lead to a formal genocide declaration, it's a turning point. It's forcing the world to look at some very uncomfortable truths about this conflict and grapple with, well, its responsibility to do something.
It's also a reminder that we don't always learn from history. The events in Gaza, as awful as they are, they're not unique. We've seen this before, this kind of violence, dehumanization in other conflicts. And if we don't learn from those past failures, how do we stop it from happening again?
We've covered a lot today, a lot. But this conversation, it doesn't end here. To everyone listening, I encourage you, keep exploring this. Read the full Amnesty report. Seek out different perspectives, analyses, and most importantly, let's talk about this. Thoughtful, informed discussions about how we create a more just, peaceful world. That's what matters.
Well said. And I'd add, we need to approach this with humility, knowing there are no easy answers. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's so complex. Understanding it means engaging with a range of perspectives, being willing to, challenge our own assumptions.
This has been, well, intense is an understatement.
Yeah.
But so important. Thank you so much for your insights, for helping us navigate this. It's tough material.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listener, I leave you with this. What can we do, big or small? What actions can we take to build a world where these kinds of atrocities, the things detailed in this report, they become history, not a horrifying reality?
Thanks to everyone for joining us on this deep dive.